Jean-Luc Picard is back.
Well, hello friends, and welcome to another episode of Generation Tech. And yes, apparently Jean-Luc Picard is back. So Patrick Stewart was on stage at the Star Trek convention in Las Vegas over the weekend with Alex Kurtzman behind him, the current guy who's basically overseeing everything to do with Star Trek, and he basically said to the audience that Jean-Luc Picard is back in a new series that will be airing sometime, maybe next year or in 2020. We're not quite sure yet. But let's just have a look at some of the details and see if we can try and piece together, a few of the details from little things that were said at the meeting and little clues that we've seen. So Patrick Stewart originally didn't want to come back. They had contacted him earlier in the year, I believe. He talks on stage about receiving an email inviting him back with an offer, and he basically refused it. He said he had a 20-minute conversation with CBS executives explaining why he wanted to refuse it. But, he's talked about how he always responds to fan mail. People have sent him some very amazing stories. And he later, after he decided he will come back, he recently released a statement on Twitter saying that he basically, he recognizes how Star Trek The Next Generation had a great impact on people's lives, and it was, kind of saying that it's a kind of an escape from the sometimes dark times that we live in now. Now, some people was thinking, is he making some kind of political statement talking about the dark times we live in? I don't think so. Although Patrick Stewart has, he's been kind of anti-Brexit in the UK, he's from the UK. He did a very funny skit, actually, making fun of Brexit.
We are here to serve the British people, not the whims of some European imperialist state.
Yeah. So he's been a bit outspoken about that.
David Cameron himself did not believe that we should leave the Union. The Leave campaign was filled with disinformation.
But to be honest, I think that what he meant by dark times wasn't some political statement. He talks about a story of a Las Vegas police officer who told him that he sees some pretty gruesome stuff in his job, but when he comes home, he often watches Star Trek The Next Generation, and it reminds him that we do have a chance to have an optimistic future. And so that's, I think, what Patrick Stewart was talking about by dark times. But in those comments, I think there is a clue to what the kind of flavor of this show could be, because Star Trek The Next Generation was an optimistic view of the future, and Patrick Stewart is saying he wants to give people optimism in doing this show. So that's a big clue to me. Now, Star Trek Discovery was a pretty dark vision of the future, and that was one reason why Seth MacFarlane, he made the Orville, because he wanted to go back to the Next Generation aesthetic and vibe, and he said in an interview, I'm all Hunger Games'd out. I'm tired of, dystopian futures. I want an optimistic view of the future again. And so to me, that might be a little clue that this show is going to go back to the roots a little bit. Patrick Stewart also said on stage that it'll come to you with the same love of the material and love of the fans that we had before, exactly the same. Which is another hint that they're going to go more back to the Next Generation vibe. Also on stage, you see behind you the door to the holodeck and the holodeck arch, exactly like in the Next Generation, using the Next Generation aesthetic. Now, I don't know whether that's just the same every year, or whether they intentionally did that because Jean-Luc Picard was going to come out of that door, so they made it like on the Enterprise D. But perhaps that could be a little clue as well, that we are going to be seeing something that is more close to the aesthetic and the optimistic view of the future that the Next Generation had. However, there will be differences. So this series is going to be set 20 years after the events of Nemesis in the Star Trek Prime timeline. And that's actually almost the same amount of time that's passed in the real world. I think it's 16 years that has passed, or by the time the series comes out, probably 18 years that will have passed. And Patrick Stewart said about Picard that he may not be a captain anymore. Now that's kind of obvious, because if 20 years had passed, he probably would have been either promoted or had retired. So he could either be an admiral, or he could be actually retired. In the last episode of Star Trek The Next Generation, All Good Things, we see him retired, living at his family's vineyard in France. They still try to pass him off as a Frenchman, even though he speaks with an English accent. I don't know, that's always bothered me about that. But anyway, so that's kind of two options. You could see him as Admiral Picard, still working in Starfleet, or perhaps he's retired and he's just freelancing around the galaxy having adventures. I don't know. I'm sure they'll work out a great story with this. Patrick Stewart also said, though, that he has been changed by his experiences. A lot may have happened in those 20 years, and he's not going to be the same Picard necessarily that you knew back in The Next Generation. Now, this could go either way. It could be cool. I absolutely hope they don't do what they did to Luke Skywalker in The Last Jedi, and they, you know, in the name of making him not what you expect, they turn him into this sort of dejected guy who doesn't want to be involved with anything. All right, I really hope they don't do that to Picard. But it would make sense if Picard has been changed somehow. You know, maybe a lot has happened in the 20 years. Maybe he's turned into a complete psycho. I don't know. You never know. But ultimately, he is going to have a lot of the traits of the character anyway, because of what you know, Patrick Stewart said before about, you know, the same love of the fans and the material. So it's going to be different. It's not going to be that different. One cool thing which I noticed is that Patrick Stewart is going to be an executive producer on this series. Now, executive producers, sometimes they basically oversee productions for the studio, or they could be one of the creators of a show. Basically, they can manage different aspects, but they're not involved in the actual production like a producer is or a director, but they kind of oversee things. So it could be that they have Patrick Stewart on as an executive producer because he's going to be giving direction on the creative aspects of the show. That's my suspicion, and that's another reason why I think it is possible that they could be really aiming to go back to the Star Trek The Next Generation vibe. Now, next section, what do I think is going to happen in this series, and what other actors do I think are going to be involved? So, at the moment, Patrick Stewart is the only one who has been announced, okay? But it would be pretty boring and a pretty missed opportunity if we didn't have other Star Trek The Next Generation actors, or even actors from other series like Voyager and DS9, appearing in this series. So Jonathan Frakes, who played Will Riker, is still very much involved with Star Trek, but behind the camera, directing. You still got Michael Dorn, who played Worf, who's actually appeared in the most Star Trek episodes of any character, because he crossed over between The Next Generation and DS9. He's still very much up for it, although he hasn't been involved with Star Trek in recent years. He did want to pitch his Chronicles of Worf TV show, which really sounded like a cool concept. I guess the studios didn't go for that, but he could totally come back, right, as an old Worf, just like what we see in the last episode of The Next Generation, All Good Things. Brent Spiner is still acting. He was in Independence Day Resurgence. He could definitely come back as Data. He's obviously older now. Data did make himself look older in All Good Things. I'm referencing this episode because we see older versions of all the characters. In that episode, he put the grey in his hair, even though he hadn't actually aged because he was an android. But it just made him fit in better. So I don't think it's a problem that Brent Spiner would have aged. You can do a lot with makeup anyway to make him look similar. So how exactly are these characters going to come back? Well, I don't think Picard will be captaining the Enterprise. I think he's going to be doing something else, either an admiral or retired or some other thing. But I do think it would be a huge missed opportunity if you didn't have the Enterprise E, the USS Titan, perhaps. Now, Riker, he went to command the Titan at the end of Nemesis. In All Good Things, though, you see him as an admiral. So I don't know whether they're going to go with that, have him as an admiral, or whether they could have him realistically commanding the Titan. In the Star Trek games, Data actually went on to command the Enterprise E, so you could have Brent Spiner as Data commanding the Enterprise E, and basically you could have Patrick Stewart as the character that ties them all together. He's in every episode, and then you have, you know, maybe some episodes you see the Enterprise, some episodes you see the Titan, you could even have the Defiant, you could even have Voyager, you know, Catherine Janeway. I mean, Kate Mulgrew is still around, she could come back as Janeway, an older version. I think you do see an Admiral Janeway in one of the episodes later on, so she could have become an Admiral by now.
Admiral Janeway, how good to see you again.
Jean-Luc.
There's also one episode of Voyager where you see Geordie LaForge commanding a Galaxy-class starship, so we know he gets his own ship.
This is Captain LaForge of the Starship Challenger.
So these are all things that could be tied in. My dream would be it's kind of like a Star Trek All-Stars series where Jean-Luc Picard is in every episode as perhaps an admiral, and he has to organize, you know, different ships to do different things. Maybe he goes on missions to certain ships, and etc. What I would like to see as well, though, is the serialization that they did with Discovery. I think that's one area where Discovery really improved on Star Trek, was the serialization. Now, Star Trek previously had been episodic. That was largely because it was a syndicated TV show, and basically different networks wanted seasons of different lengths, or they broadcast them out of order or whatever, so each episode had to be pretty much a self-contained story. With Discovery, they have a sort of overall story arc over the whole season. It's like a very, very long movie, right? Like 20-hour movie or something. Yeah. I think that's really great because it really makes you on the edge of your seat and wanting to watch the next episode, and it's just more fun. The days of episodic TV shows, I think, maybe a bit behind us. That's also one of my criticisms of The Orville. Although I really like that show, I think they could be more serialized too. So I would want to see a serialized show, Jean-Luc Picard at the center of it, guest appearances by all of the other actors in the Star Trek Prime universe. Just think about all the reveals, you know, the first time you see the USS Titan, and actually the Titan, we don't really know what it looks like, but because it's never appeared in the shows or movies, but it apparently, this is kind of a rendering of it. You can see it on the cover of some books, or this 3D rendering of it. It apparently looks like this, and it's a pretty cool aesthetic. It draws from some of the older designs, but with the sort of aesthetic of the Enterprise E kind of blended in there. So guys, that's kind of my hopes for this series. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more news about it coming out over the coming months. CBS, you know, they might want to keep the appearances by other actors secret to not spoil the reveal in the show. I think that would also be a wise decision by them, but we'll have to see. But obviously, you know, Jean-Luc Picard returning is like the news of the decade in the science fiction world, so we reported on it. Alright guys, as always, please subscribe if you're new, give this video a like, and we'll see you next time. Oh, and if you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.